We will now continue with part 2 of week 4's slides, and we are continuing on slide 6, which deals with normal versus inferior goods. Now, before we continue with figure 4.3, let's recall what a normal good and an inferior good is. Now, in first year microeconomics and in revision of chapter 2 that we did in week 1, you will recall that if the income elasticity of demand coefficient is positive, then it implies that as income increases, the quantity demanded of a good also increases, hence it's positive. So we will buy more of the good as income increases. So that is an example of a normal good. Now recall what an inferior good is. Here you will find that the income elasticity coefficient is negative. So quantity demanded declines even as income increases. Now, in this example, in figure 4.3, we have hamburgers and steaks plotted on the two axes. And which do you think is going to be the inferior good? Well, based on our income consumption curve, the hamburger is the inferior good. Now, can you see that as income increases, given that prices of hamburgers and steaks are remaining the same, I know that because the slopes of these budget constraints, they are the same, they are parallel to each other. But I can see that income has increased because my budget constraints have shifted outward, right? So as income increases, the utility maximizing combinations of steaks and hamburgers are on in different curves U1, U2, and U3 respectively. So at U1, the utility maximizing combination is going to be at A. On U2, as income increases, the utility maximizing combination of hamburgers and steaks will be at B. And then on U3, the utility maximizing combination of the two goods is at C. So this is as income increases. Now notice that between points A and B, as income increased, the consumption of both goods also increased. So both goods here are normal goods. But look at what happens between point B and point C. As income increased, we see that this portion of the curve, in fact, bends backwards. So we can see that consumption of steak has increased. So that is still a normal good. But in fact, the consumption of hamburgers, despite income having increased, it has fallen given by that bit, that small amount over there. So it, in fact, this portion actually bends backwards. So hamburgers have in fact become inferior between point B and point C as less burgers are being bought despite the higher income. This brings us to Engel curves. Now you can use your income consumption curve to derive your Engel curve. And an Engel curve shows the quantity of a good consumed in relation to the income. So here you can see our Engel curve, and we've used our income consumption curve to derive this. And we can see that this curve is going to show the relationship between the quantity of a good, so food, in relation to income. Note that income is on the vertical axis and food is on the horizontal axis. So if we look at the points, if you take note of the points, at this first point over here, we had $10 of income and it corresponded to 4 units of food. Then at this point, we had $20 of income and it would correspond to 10 units of food. And this point over here corresponds to $30 of income and 16 units of food. So these points all relate to figure 4.2a, where your income consumption curve was plotted through those 3 points. And it was plotted through the utility maximizing combinations for those respective incomes. Now, this Engel curve in figure 4.4a, you can see that it relates the quantity of food to income. And you can see that in this scenario, food is a normal good because this Engel curve is upward sloping. So here your income elasticity coefficient would be positive because as income increases, you can see the quantity demanded for food is also increasing. Now have a look at part B. Right. So this is the interesting bit where we zoom in on hamburgers. So if we look at part B in the figure, the Engel curve for hamburger consumption is positive and normal between a range of $10 and $20. So between this range over here, we can see hamburgers is a normal good because your Engel curve is positive and upward sloping. However, look at what happens in the range between $20 and $30 of income. Now you will see in that range of $20 to $30 of income, consumption of hamburgers has actually fallen. So in the range above $20. So this range over here, hamburgers is in fact an inferior good. Note the downward sloping shape of your curve, of your Engel curve. Now, example 4.1 presents the usefulness of Engel curves. Consumer expenditures on different categories of goods are examined by income group, and Engel curves can be derived for different groups of consumers. So do again work through this example for knowledge enrichment purposes. So when we revised demand in chapter 2, the demand curves demonstrated the relationship between price and quantity demanded, that you know. But factors such as income, preferences, the prices of related goods such as substitutes and complements, those were kept constant. But you know that demand is related to the prices of other goods as well. So we must quickly revisit this relationship that may exist between goods. Now, goods could be related, such as substitutes and complements, or they could be unrelated. So let's just see. Here you could have substitutes, complements, or they could be independent or unrelated. Now, examples of substitutes could be your coffee and tea, or meat and chicken, or Netflix and Showmax. So, two goods are substitutes if an increase in the price of one leads to an increase in the quantity demanded of the other, right? So that is the definition of substitutes, which you know from first year microeconomics. And then in terms of complements, complements can be defined as two goods are complements if an increase in the price of one good leads to the decrease in the quantity demanded of the other. And the examples could be your computer hardware and the computer software, cars and tires go together, your PlayStation, PS5 consoles, and games, those goods go together. And then lastly, goods that are independent, those goods are unrelated if a change in the price of one good has no effect on the quantity demanded of the other. Right, so the fact that goods can be complements or substitutes, it suggests that when we study the effects of price changes in a market, it would be important to look at the consequences in the related market. So this is always something that must be beared in mind. Okay, so we will now examine the effect of a price change in a bit more detail. Right, so here, in our example, we are going to consider a fall in the price of a good, and there are two effects that we are going to consider, and these are two very important effects, and they are called the substitution and the income effect, effect respectively. Now, the substitution effect is the response to a change in relative prices of goods, and that is called the substitution effect. So, consumers will tend to buy more of the good that has become relatively cheaper and less of those goods that are now relatively more expensive. The substitution effect shows the change in the consumption of a good due to the price change, which ultimately affects the relative prices of the good. So, if a good is relatively cheaper, that as a result of the price change, the effect is going to be shown by a movement along an indifference curve. That is important to bear in mind. Because one of the goods are now cheaper, consumers are going to enjoy an increase in real purchasing power. And the change in demand resulting from this change in purchasing power is called the income effect. So, the income effect measures the change in consumers' purchasing power. And it is going to be shown from a movement from one indifference curve to another. So there's two distinct features in your income effect versus your substitution effect. Before we analyze three important figures, figure 4.6, 4.7, and 4.8, let's look at some key terms and how it would be defined. So your substitution effect can be defined as the change in consumption of a good associated with a change in its price, with the level of utility held constant. Hence, this effect is going to be shown by a movement along an indifference curve. As mentioned in the previous slide, due to the change in the price, it's going to affect the relative prices of the good. Now, your income effect shows the change in consumption of a good resulting from an increase in purchasing power, with your relative prices now held constant. So, remember, I said previously that here you will see a movement from one indifference curve to another, because that would reflect that increase in purchasing power with relative prices held constant. Lastly, we will speak about a total effect. Now, if you think about the total, you're putting things together, right? You're aggregating things. So the total effect we are going to see in our figures is where we add our substitution and our income effect together, and that is going to give you your total effect. So theoretically, the sum of those two effects gives you your total effect of a price change. And in our example, we are looking at the effect of a fall in the price, but I could give you an increase in the price, and you would need to apply that and perhaps draw your own figures with regards to these three scenarios you're going to see in figure 4.6, 4.7, and 4.8. So I'm going to continue with that in part 3.